Welcome back to Scotty's Hobbies. In this video, I'm going to show you how to replace the front brake pads and rotors on a 2016 to 2020 Hyundai Sonata. I'm going to show you the torque specifications, the tools that you need, the parts that you need, where you're going to use lube, everything as we go. Now, if you just need torque specifications on this vehicle, make sure to look for a link in the description or in the first comment, and that'll send you to a video just covering torque specifications for the knuckle to bracket, the bracket to caliper, and the lug nuts if that's all you need. Make sure to check out the video library for other helpful videos. Like, subscribe, and share as you are watching, please. Now, you can see I'm already taking this wheel off. We're going to get this done as fast as possible. Oh yeah, this particular vehicle is a vehicle that has the electronic rear parking brake. The process will be the same on the non-electronic rear parking brake, but just so you know, everything that I'm including in this video, parts-wise, tool-wise, and torque specification-wise, is particular to the electronic rear parking brake. Now, let's get going on this, BJ. Get you done quick. With both wheels jacked up off the ground and probably supported on jack stands, you could turn the wheel by hand, as you can see right here. You're going to want to make sure that the caliper is facing outward, so it just makes it easier to get access to everything. First off, we're going to remove these 14mm bolts from the caliper to bracket. These go into the slider, so if you have any problems taking these off or removing them, when you're loosening them up, say the slider starts spinning, you could use a 17mm open-end wrench to hold the slider pins in place so they don't spin on you while you're removing these caliper to bracket bolts. They're not in there too tight. When we reinstall everything, we're going to go over proper torque brake specifications on all the bolts when we reassemble. So make sure you stay tuned to the end of the video. I'm going to show you everything you need to get this job done right. With the caliper bolts off, go ahead and remove the caliper off of the brake pads, off the rotor. And rather than just letting the caliper hang and dangle right there, we're going to use a S-hook. Before we actually hang it up there by the S-hook, take a look at everything. Make sure the dust boot on the caliper piston looks good. Make sure you don't see any moisture, because if so, go ahead and just replace that while you're doing this job. You don't want to do a Mickey Mouse job, so just make sure everything's done right. Hang that caliper up there on the spring. Make sure it's not hanging by anything. You can use a bungee cord or a coat hanger or something like that if you don't have the S-hooks. After we do that, we're going to remove these 17mm bolts from the caliper bracket to knuckle. Again, 17mm is what you're going to use. I am using a 1/2-inch breaker bar, one that I got from Duralast. This thing works pretty good. Haven't had any problems with it. And just loosen these up and remove these two bolts. These two bolts aren't too tight, but they are pretty tight compared to the caliper 2 bracket bolts. So a 1/2-inch breaker bar loosened them up. The first one I'm going to be able to remove by hand. It's not too hard. But then I had to use the 1/2-inch socket wrench, ratcheting wrench, to remove the other one the rest of the way. So you might need a 1/2-inch socket wrench as well. Again, 17mm bolts for your caliper bracket to knuckle bolts. Remove both of these bolts, and let's get ready to remove the actual caliper bracket. When we remove the caliper bracket from the knuckle, we're just going to set that off to the side. We're going to get ready to clean it all up, install new hardware, and we're going to make sure we do a good proper brake job when we get ready for reassembly. So just set that off to the side for now. With the caliper bracket off to the side, we could go ahead and remove the rotor. First off, you need to remove these retaining springs or these retaining screws, or also called production screws. You don't have to use these during reinstallation. I like to. It just makes everything easier when it's all held together in place, not wobbling around while you're trying to install the brake pads and the caliper bracket over the rotor. It just makes it much easier for assembly. That's why they use them when they are actually producing these vehicles. Again, these are called assembly screws. If you don't want to reuse these screws, you can also use a lug nut on one of the lug nut studs to hold the rotor in place. Just makes the job easier as well. We'll go over that when we do the reassembly process. If you use the impact screwdriver like I did, when you put it on to the screw, you don't want to put force turning it. You want to let the actual screwdriver do its job. So turn it in the direction you want to go. Just hold a little bit of pressure on there and knock it with the hammer. After we get the rotor off, just set that off to the side. We're going to be replacing it with a new one, so we're not going to worry about damaging it at all or whatnot. Who cares about that? Just set off to the side. We're going to clean up the hub surface. I'm using this Steelman hub surface cleaning kit that I got. It attaches to any drill. It comes with a couple sizes of these cleaning pads, but just make sure you get the hub surface nice and clean. So when we reassemble everything, it makes sure that you get a nice, clean, flat surface for that rotor to mount to. I use the wire brush, and you could use this too if you don't have that Stillman cleaning kit, but just make sure around the hub, everything, you don't have any burrs or any uneven parts built up on that surface. Grab the rotor. Let's get this thing prepped to be installed. First off, before we go too far on the installation process or reassembly process, we're going to want to make sure we clean this rotor off really good. So I like to set it here on the actual hub over the lugs and clean the back side of the rotor, spray it off with some brake clean. I use the chlorinated one. I think it's called chlorinated. You'll find a link in the description for that as well. Spray that brake clean on that rotor on the back side, and then wipe it off with a rag or a towel or something like that, and flip it over. We're going to clean the front side of it. Again, just spray some brake clean on there, wipe it all off. You just want to get the gunk that's been sitting on there from being stored on the shelf. That's like a little film that's going to be on there, and it makes it a lot easier for the bed-in process or breaking-in process when you have a nice clean rotor. So make sure you clean the rotor before you go too far, or always when you're doing a brake installation. Now that the rotor is clean, I like to use some anti-seize. You could either put this on the hub or the inside of the rotor like I'm doing here. Whichever way you want to do it isn't the wrong way, as long as you have some anti-seize so that your rotor doesn't get seized to the hub. Just makes your brake job a lot easier to do next time. Put a nice even layer of anti-seize on there. It doesn't need to be too thick. Just make sure you got a nice little film sheet on there and you'll be good to go. After you get all the anti-seize on there, you're going to be ready to install this rotor onto the hub. Again, you want to make sure that that hub is nice and clean. You want a nice flat surface for the new rotor to mount to when you're putting it on the vehicle. So again, need to have a clean hub. You have a clean rotor, you're going to have a nice flat surface for that to mount to. When you put the rotor on, make sure your screws are lined up on the hub to the rotor. So if you're going to reuse your assembly screws, they'll match up just fine. Don't need to take it off and realign them and whatnot. So make sure both of your screws line up when you're installing your rotor, especially if you're going to use your production screws. When you install these production screws, just put them on snug tight. You don't want to use the impact of the driver to tighten these up, so just snug them up. Again, if you don't want to use these screws, that's totally fine. It's up to you. I would, in that case, use a lug nut on one of the studs just to hold the rotor in place. You don't need to put more than one on. Just grab one lug nut, put it on there, just tighten it up finger tight, and that'll hold the rotor so it doesn't wobble around when you're reinstalling everything. It does make it much easier when you have a nice rotor that's sitting there flush. It's not wobbling around when you're trying to put the brake pads in the caliper bracket and put the caliper back on. Now that the rotor is up there held in place, we could go ahead and move on to getting this caliper bracket ready for reinstallation. Remove the old hardware, the old brake pads. Don't really care about them, so throw them off to the side. You could take a look at them. Make sure you take note of where your wear indicator is when you remove your old brake pads, and you always want the wear indicator on the inside pad on the leading edge of the brake pad. So in this case, it's the inside on the top. Just take a look at your brakes, just see, make sure you're getting some good even wear. Just who really cares, honestly, but it might give you an insight if something else is going on with your brake caliper or your bracket or anything like that. You might have a seized slider. Take your old hardware off. We're going to put new hardware on. And first, let's go ahead and clean these slider pins off. Remove your caliper slider pins. Clean them off really well. If you have any gunk built up on those slider pins, get something that's a little bit more abrasive and clean that all off. You want them to be nice and smooth. When we reinstall these, you could either use the grease that's provided with the brakes if you're using this Power Stop brake kit that I'm using. It comes with grease, but I like to use some ceramic grease that I have in this bottle right here. There will be a link in the description for that too. But it seems to be some really good grease that I like to use. I've been using it for about 2 years now, never had any comebacks, and you don't have any problems. When you're applying the grease, you don't want to put too much on here, just a nice coating of it. You don't want to really see too many peaks of grease on there or heaps of grease. Just coat the slider pin really well. You're going to install it into the caliper bracket. Make sure it slides in and out just fine. If you have any problems with it moving in and out, you might want to clean the bracket out a little bit better, but in this case, it was really easy. Now on this slider pin, you can see there's a little rubber grommet on this slider pin. You want to make sure that the slider pins don't get switched around and put the proper slider pins in the proper hole. So that's why I like to clean one at a time. Again, clean the residual off, all the old grease, make sure there's no gunk or buildup on these sliders or that slider, and apply some new grease to it. Not too much, just get a nice little thin layer on there, and make sure that the slider pin moves in and out of the brake caliper bracket very easily. Now this is a step that a lot of people miss when they are doing their brakes. They don't clean the bracket off where the new hardware is going to go. I just use a wire brush right here. If you have anything built up or gunk on here or anything like that, you might need to use a file or maybe like a wire brush on an angle grinder or something like that. But on this case, or in this case, this wire brush worked just fine cleaning this caliper bracket up. If you would like, you could put some anti-seize on the actual bracket right here before you install the new hardware, but just make sure it's nice and clean, that you have a nice clean flat surface for the new hardware kit to mount to. You can see I didn't use any anti-seize between the caliper bracket and the new hardware. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. I don't really know what makes my mind choose when and when not to use it. Now you'll see that I apply grease to the shims or the hardware kit, and the only reason why I do that is because the manufacturer recommends putting grease right here. Not too much, just a little, and make sure that it's proper brake grease. Some people say, and I kind of think it's right, but some people say that if you put grease right here, it could cause brake dust, road grime to build up here on the hardware and cause the pads to not move freely, which is completely possible. But again, I like to follow manufacturer recommendations when I am doing a brake job. Double check the slider pins and get ready to install your bracket over your rotor onto the knuckle. Make sure you don't get any of that grease that you put on the hardware onto the rotor. If you do, before you put everything back together, just make sure you wipe the rotor off. In this case, I didn't put much grease on there, so it's nice and clean. These 17 millimeter bolts that go into the caliper bracket into the knuckle are going to be torqued down to 65 foot-pounds. So snug them up. You might use a socket wrench to snug them up because 65 foot-pounds is pretty tight. Just get them snugged up. You're going to use probably a 1/2 inch torque wrench to get these tightened up. But again, 17 millimeter bolts for the caliper bracket to knuckle and tighten down to 65 foot-pounds. I like to use the clicking torque wrench. If you have a digital torque wrench that beeps, more power to you, go ahead and use it. But I personally like to use the clicking torque wrenches in this case. So there will be a link in the description for those as well, just like everything else that I'm using in this video. Make sure you use those links too. It supports me or helps me out a little bit, and I really appreciate it. Oh yeah, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share while you're watching this video. It helps me as well if you do so, and tell everybody about Scotty's Hobbies, please. Doing this brake job on your own is going to save you a ton of money, not just time of dropping your vehicle off or whatnot, especially after watching this video, but this brake pad kit and everything I think is about $90 I think with shipping if you buy it from the link in the description below, or Amazon or Rock Auto, anywhere. So if you do this brake job, brake pads and rotors, $190 really isn't bad. Install the brake pads into the brake caliper bracket. You could put some grease on the ears of your brake pad if you'd like. And again, make sure your wear indicator is in the proper location. So in this case, the inboard pad on the top, that's going to be the leading edge of the brake pads. After you get the brake pads loaded into the caliper bracket, these two springs right here will be installed into the top of the brake pads. These springs allow the brake pad to get released off the rotor when you let off of the brakes. So when you push on the brakes, obviously the brake pads are going to squeeze the rotor. When you let off, these springs will help the pads just depress off the rotor a little bit. So make sure you use these springs. Don't skip that step. I don't know why some people just leave them off and don't use those. I way prefer them. So you can see I like to make sure that the pads are very well moving in the brake caliper bracket. Not that they're just stuck there stationary, but you can see I'll squeeze them on there, make sure they come off of the rotor just fine. And in this case, everything is working the way it should. You can see these are the brake pad kits that I'm using, or the brake pad kit I'm using. 17, 18, 55 Power Stop Z17 brake pads, or what I'm installing in this video. You'll find a link in the description below to do that, to purchase that, I should say. Now, before we grab that caliper and compress the piston back into the caliper, let's run over to the brake fluid reservoir and loosen the cap. Don't take it off so any dust or dirt gets inside there. Remove it and put it right there on top. What you're doing here is when you push the piston back into the caliper, it's not going to cause any damage. If you overfill the reservoir, it's just going to escape out of the top rather than blowing some seals or gaskets anywhere. So just make sure your brake fluid reservoir cap is nice and loose. To compress the piston back into the caliper, I'm using a cheap caliper compression tool. You could buy one of these online. I think they're maybe $9 to $15, or even at your local auto parts store. But grab an old brake pad. You don't want to grab a new brake pad in this case, and put that on the actual piston. You're going to use that brake pad to put pressure on the piston and compress the piston back into the caliper. You can see this one, really cheap, old. Again, I paid like, I think it was like 10 bucks maybe 20 years ago, and it's still working just fine. So I highly recommend these little cheap caliper compression tools. Really, really, really good. They last a long time. When you're compressing the piston back into the caliper, just make sure your boot doesn't get twisted somehow. Make sure it just seats back inside the caliper nice and fine. If yours has extra air in there and it doesn't look like it's seating properly, you could go ahead and just peel that boot back a little bit, the dust boot, and release the air that's inside there. And it's no biggie to do so. You'll run into that problem every now and then. Push the piston all the way back into the caliper as far as it could go. You don't want you don't want the piston to be protruding out of that caliper at all. Just makes it easier to install the caliper over the brake pads when you're doing so. Oh yeah, I also forgot. You can, if you like, put some grease on the backside of your brake pads. It might cause a squeaking dampener or sound dampener, or act like a squeaking dampener or sound dampener. So if you'd like, go ahead and put grease on the backside of your brake pads. These power stop brake pads have really good anti-squeak or anti-squeal shims on them. I really like them. Again, I've never had any problems, and sometimes I'll put grease on there, sometimes I won't. And I don't know what in my mind causes me to do that or not to do it. So that's another thing that you could do if you like. Grab that caliper with the piston compressed all the way in. You might need to use one hand to hold the brake pads together while you're installing the caliper over the brake pads, and just make sure everything sits on there nice and easy. If it's hard to put the caliper on, just take it off, double check, make sure everything is put together properly. Make sure your slider pins are pushed all the way into the caliper bracket. Everything should seat back together, fit back together nice and easy with no problems. Now these caliper to bracket bolts, these are going to be 14 millimeter bolts, and you're going to tighten these up to 20 foot-pounds. Not that tight, really, really easy to strip these out. And that's one reason why proper brake torque specifications is really important. You don't want to strip anything, you don't want to break anything, and you don't want anything to rattle loose or vibrate loose while you're driving down the road. To tighten these up, I'm using a 3/8 torque wrench, and I'm going to use the 17 millimeter open end to hold the slider pins in place. Again, a 14 millimeter bolt on both of these, and tighten them down to 20 foot-pounds. I'm using the clicking style torque wrench, just my preference. If you have a digital one, the digital one might work on both of your bolts in this case. So the caliper to bracket and the caliper bracket to knuckle bolts, you might be able to use the digital one on both of those bolts, which might make it a little bit easier for you. Now that everything is installed back on the vehicle, you're not done just yet. You want to go over to the driver's seat. You want to push on the brake pedal. Usually within 3 to 5 presses of the brake pedal, you're going to get a nice, firm, stiff pedal. Just make sure that you get that. If it stays going down to the floor, you might have some other problems, such as your booster going bad, a leak somewhere, everything. With that nice, firm pedal, you know you're good. Go back over to your brake fluid reservoir, make sure you're at the full line, and go ahead and tighten that cap. With the cap tightened up on the reservoir, go back over to the wheel, the rotor, the brakes, whatever, and turn your wheel back into the straight direction. Remove that lug nut if you did use one on there to make sure everything was staying in place, and you're ready to put your wheel on. You're pretty much done. But one more very important part or step in the process of doing brakes, tightening the lug nuts down to proper torque specifications as well. Also, make sure you tighten your lug nuts up in a star pattern. They do prefer, or what is recommended, is to snug up the lug nuts onto the wheel and then lower the vehicle down onto the ground and then torque the wheel lug nuts down. You could tighten everything up while it's in the air. This is a front wheel drive. As long as you're in drive, it's not going to turn, but it's a lot easier if you go ahead and just put the vehicle on the ground and tighten these lug nuts up. When tightening up the lug nuts, you're going to want to tighten your lug nuts up to 80 foot-pounds, again, in a star pattern. You don't want to go in a circle pattern. You want to make sure that the wheel is sitting nice and flush up against the rotor. You don't want to cause any vibration or cause the lug nuts to come off while you're driving down the road. So star pattern, tightening them up. Now that you have the lug nuts torqued down to proper torque specifications, you are all done. You could move on to the next side and get this whole thing done. Again, this job should take you about an hour and 45 minutes around there to get everything done. It doesn't take too long. You're going to save a ton of money doing it yourself. If this video did help you out, make sure to comment below with the year, make, and model of the vehicle that it did help you on. Check out the video library for a ton of other helpful videos. I'm going to be posting more videos on this Sonata as we go along. This is my niece's wife's car, so I'm going to be caring for it. get everything tightened up, you are all set. Thank you for watching Scotty's Hobbies. I hope you enjoyed this video. Check out the video library. I'll see you guys on the next hopefully helpful video.